Watch it, old man, one of the teenagers snarled as he deliberately bumped into 90-year-old Arthur Green, sending him stumbling off the curb and into the busy street. Horns blared. Arthur caught his balance just in time, his heart pounded, not from fear, but from a sudden cold rage. The teens just laughed, high-fiving each other as they swaggered off. 20 minutes later, as they were still congratulating themselves in a nearby alley, the alley entrance was suddenly blocked by two imposing figures in Marine Corps dress blues, followed by the distinct, disciplined sound of marching boots. If you believe respect for elders, especially our veterans, is non-negotiable, type honor below. Arthur Green had lived 90 years and most of them had been dedicated to service. He'd enlisted as a boy, lying about his age to fight in World War II, then stayed in through Korea and completed one tour in Vietnam, before finally retiring as a master gunnery sergeant in the United States Marine Corps. His small apartment was filled with carefully preserved mementos, faded photographs, service commendations, and a shadow box displaying his medals. He never wore the medals, but he cherished them as reminders of the men he'd fought alongside and the sacrifices they had made. His body was frail now, each step was slow and aided by a simple wooden cane, but his eyes still held the clear, direct gaze of a man who had faced death and never blinked. That afternoon, Arthur put on a well-worn cardigan and a plain cap before stepping outside. He locked his apartment door, the key clicking in the lock like a ceremony, and made his way down the narrow hallway to the street. The late spring air was warm but not humid. A soft breeze rippled through the leaves of the elms that lined the sidewalk. Arthur had taken this same route every Wednesday for the past decade, a walk to the local bakery for his weekly treat, a single éclair. It was a small indulgence, but it was something to look forward to. The neighborhood had changed over the years. Buildings he remembered from his younger days had been torn down or repurposed. Some neighbors came and went, and others stayed put, watching the world move around them. Still, he felt at home here. He was not one to complain, even if he had more than enough reason. Arthritis had made his hands stiff, and his hearing was nearly gone. He typically wore one earbud tuned to the constant hum of news on the radio. He never paid it full attention, but it kept him company. Today, though, he'd left it at home. A walk in silence seemed fitting given the weight of his thoughts. Arthur moved deliberately, holding his cane in his right hand and his left curled into a loose fist at his side. He didn't want to be a burden. He'd lived long enough to know that kindness was scarce. Still, he greeted the few neighbors he passed with a nod and a hoarse, "Good afternoon." Most responded in kind, though some glanced away quickly. Arthur didn't begrudge them. It was simply how people were these days, polite at a distance, courteous when necessary, but rarely inclined to linger. He reached the end of his block and paused at the corner of Elm Street and 3rd Avenue. To his right, across the intersection, was the bakery, a small red brick building with a striped awning over the display window. The sign simply read, "Baker's Corner," in faded white letters. Its windows were steamed from ovens inside, and he could almost smell the scent of fresh donuts and pastries waiting beyond. To his left were a few shops, a barber, a dry cleaner, and the local hardware store that Arthur used to frequent when he needed supplies for projects around the house. Now he hardly left the apartment except for this weekly walk. Normally, Arthur would have stayed on the main sidewalk, but today there was a group of teenagers sprawled across the narrow bench outside the bakery. Their legs were stretched out, forcing pedestrians off the curb and into the gutter. They leaned back with casual arrogance, scrolling through phones or tossing sunflower seed shells onto the pavement. Their music, drawing from someone's Bluetooth speaker, thumped so loudly that Arthur could hear it from 10 feet away. They were a familiar sight in the neighborhood, a pack of 4 or 5 youths, usually found loitering, their boredom manifesting as petty vandalism and the occasional intimidation of passersby. Arthur usually gave them a wide berth, not out of fear, but to avoid unnecessary confrontation. He'd learned long ago that reasoning with teenagers in packs was rarely productive. Today, however, they were directly blocking his path. Taking a deep breath, Arthur adjusted his cap and shifted his weight on the cane. He lifted a hand in a gesture that he hoped was inoffensive. "Excuse me, lads," he began, his voice low but firm. "Could I trouble you to let an old soldier pass?" The word soldier was automatic, an old habit. The leader of the group, a tall youth wearing a backwards baseball cap and an arrogant sneer, looked Arthur up and down with undisguised contempt. "Old soldier, huh?" the leader repeated, tilting his head. "What are you, 100? He took a step forward, blocking Arthur's path while his companions snickered behind him. Arthur felt the cane shift slightly on the pavement beneath his foot. He planted it firmly as he tried again, ignoring the jibes. Just trying to get to the bakery, sons. If you wouldn't mind. He forced a polite tone. His hand remained on the head of the cane. Mind. The leader echoed, eyes narrowing. He stretched his legs further, completely blocking the walkway. Yeah, I think we do mind. This is our bench, Grandpa. Find another rote. One of the smaller teens, with a pierced eyebrow and a smirk, chimed in. Yeah, maybe you should just go home and take a nap before you fall over. They all laughed and slapped each other's backs. Arthur felt a familiar stirring of disciplined anger, the kind he hadn't felt in years. But he kept his voice level. There's no need for rudeness, son. I'm just asking for a little courtesy. The leader's sneer deepened. He stood even taller and leaned in closer to Arthur, as if asserting dominance. Courtesy. Maybe you should show some respect to your betters. With that, he did something utterly unexpected and wantonly cruel. As Arthur tried to step around him, the teen deliberately stuck out his foot, tripping the old man, while simultaneously shoving him hard on the shoulder. Watch it, old man. The boy snarled just before Arthur's balance gave out. Arthur stumbled off the curb, his cane flying from his grasp, and landed heavily but thankfully upright in the path of oncoming traffic. Horns blared furiously. A car swerved violently to avoid him. Arthur's heart hammered, his mind flashed back to battlefield injuries that had taken less effort to dodge. He scrambled back toward the curb, his old reflexes startlingly sharp. The teenagers roared with laughter, pointing and jeering. Look at him dance. One shouted. Maybe he learned that in the war. They high-fived each other and bumped fists. A few startled pedestrians yelled at them, but the teens just sauntered off down a nearby alleyway, still chuckling, not bothering to check if Arthur was all right. A kind woman who had been standing across the street rushed forward. Those dreadful boys, she exclaimed, helping him back to his feet and steadying him by the elbow. Are you hurt, dear? Her voice was full of genuine concern. She was in her 50s, dressed in a simple summer dress, and introduced herself as Mrs. Patel, a longtime neighbor. Arthur managed a shaky smile, brushing off debris from his sleeves. Just startled, ma'am. Thank you for your kindness. He rummaged for his cane, which the woman handed back to him. His hip ached from the stumble, and for a moment he felt winded. But the humiliation cut deeper than the pain. He had faced enemy soldiers who showed more honor than those boys did today. He took a deep breath, standing straight. I'm fine, really. He nodded his thanks to Mrs. Patel and began to walk toward the bench outside the bakery, his appetite gone. Part of him considered just going home. He opened his mouth to tell her he didn't need anything else, but then he hesitated. As he turned to leave, something stopped him. Not just the ache in his hip, but a deeper, older instinct that had steeled him through 3 wars. He was a Marine. Marines didn't just walk away from an unprovoked assault, not at 90. He wouldn't confront those teens himself. His fighting days were long over. He still remembered how to use his arms, but he also remembered the consequences of letting anger guide action. There were other ways to handle this. He knew the neighborhood. He knew that alley led to a dead end behind a derelict warehouse, a favorite hangout for local troublemakers. And he knew the Marine Corps recruiting station was only 2 blocks away, on the corner of Elm 3rd. He had met the Master Sergeant in charge, Master Sergeant Gunny Miller, once at a VFW event. Gunny Miller, a young but hard-as-nails Marine, had a particular soft spot for old vets like Arthur. Arthur fumbled for his old cell phone, the one with large buttons and no fancy apps. He flipped it open and dialed the main line for the recruiting station. The phone rang 3 times. Marine Corps Recruiting Station, Sergeant Peterson speaking. How can I help you? Sergeant Peterson. Arthur's voice was low but clear. This is Master Gunnery Sergeant Arthur Green, retired. I need to speak with Gunny Miller. It's a matter of immediate concern regarding disrespect shown to the uniform and an assault on an elderly Marine. The location is the alleyway behind the old packing plant, corner of Elm 3rd. There was a brief pause on the other end. Arthur could hear faint shuffling, as if the call had been transferred. Sergeant Peterson's voice came back sharper and more alert. Master Gunnery Sergeant Green, sir, Stanby. Connecting you to Gunny Miller. A click, and the connection shifted. A deep, controlled voice answered. Gunny Miller. Gunny, it's Arthur Green. Master Gunnery Sergeant, retired. Master Gunnery Sergeant Green, sir. What can I do for you? Arthur recounted what had happened in a steady, factual tone, the blocked sidewalk, the insults, the deliberate shove into traffic, and the fact that the teens were currently holed up in the dead end alley. There was no embellishment in his voice. He finished quietly. They disrespected the corpse, Gunny, and they put one of its own in harm's way for a cheap laugh. On the other end, there was a long, tense silence. Then Gunny Miller's voice came back like ice. Master Gunny, are you injured, sir? Shaken. A bit bruised, but functional, Arthur replied. Understood. Ilm 3rd, you said. The alley behind the packing plant. How many of them? 4 or 5 young, mid-teens, I'd guess. Consider it handled. Master Gunny. Gunny's voice was tight with a controlled fury that Arthur recognized from training. Well, you stay clear of that alley, sir. We'll counsel them, Marine Corps style. Then the line went dead. Arthur knew exactly what Marine Corps style counseling entailed, especially when delivered by a motivated Gunny and his eager recruits. He found a bench with a clear view of the alley entrance, sat down and waited. Every minute felt like 5. His hip throbbed, and his cane rested on the ground between his feet. He thought about all the times he'd waited for orders in his youth, the hush before dawn on some foreign shore, the tension before a drill instructor's whistle, the quiet moments before a firefight. Waiting now produced the same adrenaline, even after 90 years. Less than 10 minutes later, he saw movement at the far end of the street. At first, it was subtle, a ripple in the crowd on the other sidewalk, heads turning, people pausing in mid-step. Then he noticed 2 Marines in dress blues, their trousers sharply creased, standing motionless at the mouth of the alley like sentinels. Behind them moved 6 more, some in service khakis, others in utility uniforms, as though they had come from a training detail. They advanced with disciplined speed and purpose. Shoulders squared, heads level, each step deliberate. There was no sound except the faint click of their boots on pavement. Arthur rose slowly to his feet, leaning on his cane. He watched as Gunny Miller appeared at the rear of the formation. Gunny was in service Charlies, his collar rank insignia polished to a mirror sheen. His posture was rigid, like a lightning rod of authority. He had short, cropped hair, a stern jaw, and eyes that seemed to bore into whoever he confronted. Arthur felt both pride and relief swell in his chest. He gave a small nod as Gunny's gaze briefly flicked in his direction, an acknowledgement. Then Gunny turned and disappeared into the entrance of the alley, leading 6 of his Marines with him. 2 stayed behind, their hands clasped behind their backs, blocking any chance of escape. Arthur strained to hear what was happening in the alley. At first, there was nothing, no shouts, no scuffle, just the low hum of traffic in the distance. Then, after a moment, he heard Gunny Miller's voice carrying through the narrow space, each word punctuated by measured emphasis but not raised in volume. The tone was unmistakable, the tone of a drill instructor dressing down a particularly witless recruit. Arthur couldn't make out the exact words, but he knew the rhythm of Marines correcting behavior. It was harsh, unambiguous, and designed to break pride without resorting to violence. He could hear the teens shifting uncomfortably, maybe trying to speak up, but Gunny kept talking. His voice was like a heavy hand pressing down on their spirits, laying out exactly why their actions were unacceptable, why disrespecting an elderly veteran was beneath contempt, why mocking a uniform meant they dared challenge the core values of honor, courage, and commitment. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 5 or 6 minutes, Gunny's voice halted. There was a brief pause, then another Marine stepped forward, one of the younger ones, perhaps a corporal or lance corporal, speaking with equal firmness. This time, the tone was more instructional, explaining the finer points of respecting elders, respecting veterans, respecting the community. Arthur recognized the structure from his days as an instructor. First, break them down. Second, build them back up with the right training and values. He could hear the teens swallowing hard, their earlier laughter and bravado vanished. There were no sounds of physical violence, no scuffle, no impact. Just the weight of disciplined words. Then silence. Arthur watched as one by one, 4 or 5 pale faces emerged from the alley's gloom. The teens had been changed. Their shoulders slumped, and their eyes darted to the ground. They avoided eye contact as they shuffled past the 2 Marines blocking the exit. It looked as if each step felt like a penance. When they finally reached the street, they didn't run. They walked, almost crept, down Elm 3rd, casting fearful glances over their shoulders as if expecting more wrath to descend. Gunny Miller and his Marines emerged from the alley a few moments later. Gunny still wore a stern expression, but there was a hint of grim satisfaction in his eyes. He approached Arthur, snapped to a perfect salute, and waited until Arthur returned it. "Master Gunnery Sergeant Green, sir," Gunny said. His tone was clipped but respectful. "The situation has been addressed. Those young men have received a thorough orientation on the Corps' values, honor, courage, and commitment, with a particular emphasis on respecting their elders and those who have served." Arthur stood tall, his hand steady at his brow in response to Gunny's salute. For a moment, he searched Gunny's face. Even after all these years, he could still feel the bond of the uniform. "Thank you, Gunny," he said. "And thank your Marines for me, No thanks necessary, Master Gunnery Sergeant, Gunny replied. He nodded once sharply. We take care of our own, always. And we don't tolerate disrespect to the cause or those who built its legacy. He paused, then added quietly, Are you sure you're all right, sir? Need a ride anywhere? Medical attention. Arthur looked down at his hip. It still ached, but he straightened slightly. I'm fine, Gunny. A small bruise, but nothing a stiff drink and a good night's rest can't fix. You and your men have already provided the best medicine. Gunny Miller gave a single curt nod. All right. Leathernecks fall in. Back to the station, and good work. His order was crisp and final. The Marines formed up in formation, each one immaculate in stance, executed a smart about-face, and marched away with the same disciplined precision they had arrived with. Not a word was spoken among them, only the soft echo of boots on pavement. The street fell silent again. Arthur watched them go, feeling warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the spring sun. He had felt invisible so often in recent years, his age making him something people either pitied or ignored. But today, he felt seen. He felt respected, not like a burden or an invisible old man, but like a Marine. And in that moment, he knew deeply that the Marine Corps ethos didn't fade with age or wither with hardship. It endured. It was something that bound them together across decades and battlefields. He lowered his gaze toward the bench where he'd been sitting. There sat his cane, leaning against the slats. He retrieved it and felt its familiar weight in his hand. He took a careful step toward the bakery, adjusting the grip. For the first time that afternoon, he felt his appetite return. The bakery door stood open, the bell tinkling softly as customers came and went. Inside, a baker handed a tray of eclairs to a young mother, who smiled and paid before leaving. Arthur entered, the warmth of the interior washing over him. He approached the counter. The baker, a middle-aged man named Louis with flour on his apron, looked up and gave Arthur a bright greeting. Good afternoon, Master Green. The usual, he asked. Arthur returned the smile. Yes, thank you, Louis. He reached for his wallet and paid for the eclair. As he held the pastry box, he felt a quiet satisfaction. It wasn't just about the treat, it was about finishing what he'd started. Back on the street, a few neighbors gave him nods of respect as he passed. A security guard from the grocery store across the way offered a thumbs up and a small salute. Arthur acknowledged each gesture with a subtle nod, his chin raised just enough to meet their eyes. Inside the box, the eclair sat snugly, its glossy chocolate coating glinting in the sunlight. He could feel his mouth water at the thought of breaking through to the creamy filling inside. Arthur turned down a side street that led back toward his apartment. The neighborhood felt different now, fresher, cleaner, as though a wind had blown away the indifference that sometimes settled over these blocks. Children playing in a nearby yard paused to watch him pass. He gave them a quick wave. They waved back, curious about the older man walking with such a steady gait. Inside his apartment, Arthur set the eclair on the small wooden kitchen table. He arranged his medals in the shadow box on the wall so they caught a sliver of afternoon light. He sat down in a worn wooden chair, placed his cane by his side, and took a deep breath. Then he picked up the eclair and, for the first time that day, allowed himself to relax. The pastry was sweet, rich without being cloying, and each bite reminded him of simpler times, the taste of victory after training drills, the brief moments of peace between tours overseas, the camaraderie of those who had served. He closed his eyes and savored the rest. When he finished, he sat quietly for a while, gazing out the window at the street below. The late afternoon sun slanted across the pavement, casting long shadows. He watched the neighborhood continue on. A teenager on a bicycle rode past, ringing his bell. An elderly couple walked slowly by, leaning on each other. Mr. Chen, another tenant in his building, watered the flowers outside his doorstep. Arthur smiled to himself. He felt seen, he felt respected. For one brief moment, the weight of 90 years felt as if it had lifted from his shoulders. The Marines had reminded him of what it meant to be part of something larger than himself. That honor and respect were not abstract ideals but living, active commitments. He rose from the chair and walked to a small cabinet where he kept his phone and letters. He picked up a stack of mail. A notification from Social Security, a magazine subscription renewal, a letter from a distant cousin. Beneath those, he found an envelope embossed with the Marine Corps insignia. He opened it carefully and removed the contents. A certificate of appreciation for his decades of service, signed by the regional commander. It was dated earlier this month, but he hadn't opened it until now. He ran his fingers over the Marine emblem at the top, and then read the brief text. In grateful recognition of your selfless dedication and unwavering commitment to duty, the United States Marine Corps extends its deepest appreciation to Master Gunnery Sergeant Arthur Green, USMCR Ret. Arthur's eyes grew misty, and his lips curved into a small, genuine smile. He folded the certificate and placed it on the table next to the Eclair box. He thought of the teens in that alley, how quickly their arrogance had evaporated. He thought of Gunny Miller's voice, stern, uncompromising, unafraid to remind them of values they had likely never considered. He thought of the Marines who had stood behind Gunny, each one a living testament to discipline and purpose. Arthur settled into his favorite armchair by the window. He placed the certificate on his lap, his hands resting on the edge of it. Outside, the world continued on its usual course. Yet something had shifted. The neighborhood had witnessed that moment of respect, and word would spread. People would talk about the day the Marines taught a handful of teenagers a lesson in decency. They would talk about the sight of Marine dress blues standing sentinel in a back alley. And they would talk about Arthur Green, a 90-year-old veteran who refused to be invisible. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and let a single thought settle over him: Zer Fidelis, always faithful. He had lived by those words his entire life, and today they had been honored once more. He had the Marine Corps in his blood, and it flowed as strongly now as it had when he first enlisted decades ago. The afternoon sun dipped lower, and the room grew warm with the glow of evening. Arthur opened his eyes and looked around at the simple furnishings of his apartment. Each item carried a memory: the old wooden desk where he wrote letters to his wife when he was overseas, the bookshelf holding dog-eared paperbacks and military histories, the framed photo of him and his platoon in Korea. He felt content, a rare feeling these days. He rose slowly, retrieved his cane, and made his way to the window. He watched as people came and went on the street below, each absorbed in their own lives. But he also saw the subtle changes. A bench that had once been the teens' lounging spot was now empty. A florist set up a vase of fresh lilies at the corner flower stand, and a small sign appeared on a lamppost: in honor of veterans, please show respect. Someone had taken the time to print it neatly and poster it. Arthur recognized the handwriting. It belonged to Mrs. Patel, the woman who had helped him after the shove into traffic. She always carried a box of printed notices for neighborhood watch meetings and local events. This time, she had used her flyers for something else: a subtle demand for courtesy in public. Arthur rapped lightly on the glass of the window. On the opposite sidewalk, Mrs. Patel looked up, saw him, and gave him a thumbs up. He returned the gesture before he turned away. Inside, the evening shadows deepened. Arthur walked to his front door, paused, then took a final look back at the living room. He unlocked the door and stepped into the small hallway. He paused by the coat rack to hang his cardigan and cap. Then he stood there for a moment, a small smile playing at his lips. He ran his fingers over the certificates and photos lining the hallway before closing the door behind him. For 90 years, Arthur Green had stood for something: service, honor, and respect. Today, he had reminded everyone who witnessed the scene that those values were still alive. He closed his apartment door and leaned against it, as if catching his breath after another drill. Inside, he could hear the hum of the overhead light, the gentle tick of the wall clock. He thought of tomorrow's walk, to the library for his weekly reading session, and the many walks after that. He thought of all the young faces he'd passed this week, some indifferent, some curious, some respectful. He thought of the Marines who had answered his call, and of Gunny Miller's voice echoing in that narrow alley. He felt a surge of pride that he wasn't sure he had felt since leaving Vietnam. After a few moments, Arthur shuffled down the hallway to his small bedroom. He placed his cane beside the bed and sat at the edge, pulling the blanket around him. Inside, he opened his eyes to the familiar shape of his dog-eared copy of the Bible, open to a page marked by a worn ribbon: Honor your father and mother. He closed it, leaned back, and closed his eyes. Outside, the streetlights flickered on. Somewhere, a car door slammed. A child's laughter drifted from a window. Arthur listened for a moment, allowing the sounds of the neighborhood to envelop him. Then he let sleep come, the lines of his face relaxing. Tomorrow would bring another day, another chance to walk down Elm 3rd and remember what it meant to be a Marine, a veteran, a citizen, and, above all, an old man who refused to be ignored. Because some lines you just don't cross ever. Zer Fidelis.